The sky above the barley fields was bright blue like fire, and the wind moved through the grain like a huge sleeping creature breathing. Engines sat on workbenches with their parts open, shining metal bright as new coins, far away where the sky meets the ground. A giant man wearing golden armor shook hands with a man whose hands were dirty with oil. Next to the giant stood a thin girl with blue skin, her eyes the color of frozen river water, her shoulders bare in the heat, her silence heavy like a decision. People had said she was too small for royal blood. They had said he was too human to matter. The emperor had come to give away what he thought was worthless. The mechanic thought he was taking on a problem. Both were wrong, and the fields would remember the day the wind changed its song. The farming planet Aura had an atmosphere like a glass bell. Sounds traveled far, and people's opinions traveled even farther. The towns were low to the ground, made of metal sheets for shade and sun-baked concrete, while the empire of Valor came down from space. Ships like knives, banners like melted metal, announcements that fell like unwanted rain. Elias Ward worked alone where the barley met his workshop's shadow. He was an old-fashioned mechanic, one hand to feel, one to listen, a head that waited before deciding. Aura's farmers brought him their seed drones and watering machines, their harvesting crawlers and wind harps. Machine spoke, he always said. If you stayed quiet long enough, a bolt would tell you how it wanted to sit. A bearing would whisper its favorite angle. The Empire didn't love quiet men. The Empire loved big shows, tall things, and gold. So people were already gathered when Emperor Valor arrived, all polished armor and shoulders like a cathedral, light pooling on his rough blue skin, and royal designs carved into his armor like veins of a living planet. His voice rumbled low, the kind that made metal hum along with it. Aura's wind held perfectly still, as if it was afraid to breathe. Next to him stood the girl. She looked about 16 by human guessing, though her species grew up differently. She had the same blue skin as her father, but softer, a shade like shadowed morning. Her hair was dark, loose, moving restlessly in the wind. Her height, just reaching her father's hip armor, was the insult that followed her like a shadow. In a palace that measured worth in height, she was a sentence that never fit on the page. "This is Naira, my daughter," said Valor. Only then did the crowd begin to whisper, because to name someone was to claim them. And the Emperor's claim had always been the tallest of all. "She will be placed in your care." "Mechanic," said Valor, turning his burning gaze on Elias. "The council whispers about how short she is. They count it like a mistake in a book. Let them count. A machine that won't fit in a tower might still work in a field." Elias said nothing at first. It wasn't respect. It was the careful habit of a man who knew that answers cost something, and that silence could buy time. Naira looked at the ground. The metal of the Emperor's glove tightened once around Elias's hand, then let go. "I fix gears," said Elias finally, the words dry as the day. "I don't fix daughters." "Gears, daughters, galaxies," said Valor with a smile that had no warmth in it. "All are systems. All obey balance. Balance is your craft, isn't it?" The crowd snickered in a low, wet way. A boy near the front pretended to hold a measuring stick. A woman whispered, "Too short for a throne, long enough to be a pawn." The Empire's recording drones captured everything as drones do. Elias looked at Naira's wrists, thin, the tendons like silk cords, the hands steady despite the crowd. He had seen machines that shook when their insides were empty. "She didn't shake. She can stay," said Elias. Valor tilted his head as if a star had bowed. He turned, armor throwing pieces of light across the barley, and walked back to his landing ship, the air crackling behind him. The sky swallowed him. The sound of engines faded, and with it the brief amazement people feel when power leaves and they're left with themselves. Naira stood in the hot quiet. Someone laughed. Someone else threw a seed that hit her shoulder and slid off without a sound. "You'll sleep in the storage room," said Elias, pointing toward the workshop. "It smells like metal and rain. If that's a problem, you can complain to the barley." She didn't smile. She nodded once. Behind them, the crowd's laughter grew thicker. But while the field laughed, the girl's eyes shimmered faintly, as if holding a truth older than the stars. Word travels differently in small places. By noon the next day, the settlement knew the Emperor had thrown away his daughter like a broken bolt. By evening, they knew Elias had accepted the gift. Insult, burden, pick your word. By dawn, Overseer Catherine knew, and Catherine was a man who polished his boots with other people's fear. He arrived at Elias's workshop with a group of local officials who enjoyed doing simple things cruelly. Catherine wore a fake version of imperial style, cheap gold coating on a chest piece that creaked when he breathed too hard. His voice was the kind that asked, "Are you going to fight me?" while his eyes answered, "Please don't, mechanic." "The Empire is generous," said Catherine, spreading his arms over the table covered with engines and tools. "It gives us the chance to show our obedience. Let us show we can raise royal trash to useful function." Naira flinched at the word trash, but only like a wire hums when touched. Elias stood between her and the group without thinking. The barley moved in a deep breeze that hadn't been there a moment before. "We'll host a test in the Hall of Scale," said Catherine, lips wet. "Before the midday bell, the Emperor's child will put together a resonance engine while everyone watches. If she fails, you both answer for mocking imperial grace. And if she succeeds," said Elias. Catherine smiled as if success were a joke he'd heard at a funeral. "Then we'll all be surprised," said Catherine. The group chuckled. Drones above clicked their lenses. Children practiced cruel rhymes about height because cruelty likes a rhythm. Elias looked at Naira. Her gaze touched the horizon, then fell back to the workbench, to the open insides of machines. "We'll go," said Naira, speaking for the first time. Her voice had depth to it, like the low notes of a song you almost forgot but find yourself humming anyway. "You don't have to perform for them," said Elias. "I'm always performing," said Naira. "This will at least have tools." They went. The Hall of Scale was named for the beautiful set of brass balances that hung there, meant to measure crops, debts, favors, everything that could be weighed and nothing that truly mattered. The whole ceiling was a shimmer of thin glass laced with wires that glowed when the Empire sent out announcements. Today, it glowed like a low fever. On a long table lay the taken-apart resonance engine, a core like a captured storm, a ring frame to focus it, counter spindles, harmonic dampeners, memory coils where the engine kept its favorite songs. Naira blinked once, and a shadow crossed her eyes, the kind that comes from remembering a room you pretended to forget. "Begin," said Catherine. His smile was an insult with teeth. Phones, yes, even in galaxies someone has a phone, rose to record. Laughter rose with them. The children had learned their rhyme. Naira laid her hands on the core. The movement in the room smoothed as if a large hand had pressed the air flat. She didn't move for a count of 12. She listened. Elias recognized it. It was the look he wore when gears told their secrets. "She won't even try," said someone loudly. "She's too short to reach the top ring," said another, and a small wave of laughter rang out. Naira breathed in. She reached, not with her arms first, but with a voice too low to hear, yet too real to ignore. The core brightened in a pulse that matched her heartbeat. No one believed she would even try. But the silence that followed spread across the room like a storm. Naira moved without hurrying. She set the counter spindles in their holders, but at angles nobody used in the instruction books. She took a memory coil, brushed it with her thumb, and a thin line of blue rose inside it as if pleased to be seen. The hall murmured, because there are ways of touching that are either worship or science, and sometimes both. Catherine leaned forward, cheeks damp. "The frame first, girl, or the core spills," said Catherine. "The core is already framed," said Naira, not looking up. "You simply never asked what shape it preferred." Elias nearly laughed. He kept his mouth closed because the air had the brittle quality of dishes before an earthquake. He watched the way Naira's fingers barely lifted when moving a piece, as if she shaped motion and let the pieces travel within it instead of forcing them along. He had done this with engines all his life. He had never seen it done with such closeness. "Where did you learn?" said Elias softly. "In rooms where I wasn't tall enough for the mirrors," said Naira. The crowd snickered at that. They didn't know how to hear the heartbreak of a palace. A woman in a farmer's jacket. Mara stepped closer, curious, moving past caution. "Let the child work, Catherine," said Mara. "You'll ruin the balance with your breath." "My breath is the law," said Catherine. But he stepped back because law is often nothing more than a man who doesn't like being watched while he's being mean. Naira installed the harmonic dampeners last. She closed her eyes and hummed a note too low for human ears. The engine brightened as if agreeing. When she opened her eyes, something passed through them. A translation of light into memory. Elias's chest tightened. Some people listen to machines. Naira was listened to by them. Catherine clapped slowly, a fake version of praise. "The spin will shake at startup, little one," said Catherine. "Your frame is artistic. We need function." Naira looked at Elias. He could offer nothing but the true gift of any craftsperson, faith that the work will defend itself. Naira touched the starter. The resonance engine stirred, and just when everyone thought she would fail, the engine sang. It wasn't loud. Sound wove into air the way barley weaves beneath wind. The ring frame rotated at a small offset, then fixed itself along a curve that felt like forgiveness. The harmonic dampeners drank the shake. The core's light steadied into a breathing that matched Naira's own. She stepped away, palms at her sides, throat working as if swallowing back an old hunger. "It will run 5% more efficiently than your chart," said Naira. Someone laughed to crush the wonder trying to be born. Catherine raised a hand for quiet, but his fingers shook. "I see only rebellion by art," said Catherine. "We need proof," he signaled. An assistant wheeled forward a stress frame, a cruel scaffold used to wrench engines into failure for test data. He fastened it to the resonance engine like chains. "If it survives this, we'll consider your art," said Catherine. Naira's breath stuttered. Elias stepped forward. "Enough," said Elias. "The demonstration is public, mechanic," said Catherine, sweet as vinegar. "Let the Empire be entertained." Mara moved as if to stand beside Elias, but a guard blocked her with easy cruelty. "I can endure it," said Naira, almost to herself. Elias looked at her and saw the shape of 1,000 rooms where she had been smaller than the expectations inside them. He put his hand on the engine casing. "Then so will I," said Elias. The stress frame started with a howl. The resonance engine bucked. The frame shivered. The hall's ceiling wires flickered with the strain, throwing nets of white light over faces that wanted blood. Catherine smiled. And in that smile was the smallness of men who need the world to fail where they can't succeed. Elias kept his palm against the casing. The temperature climbed. His skin picked up a quick burn, then a deep one. He tasted copper. Naira stood with her eyes closed, humming a sound so soft it might have been the idea of sound. The engine fought the frame like a heart fights a spasm. Elias's mind went to the barley fields, to the way wind never argued with the grain, only taught it to bend and then rise. He spoke to the engine the way he had spoken to himself after his wife had left in the old years, when loneliness was a room that had learned his name. "You don't have to break to teach them," said Elias, not loudly, but with a weight of voice that machines like. Naira's hum bent half a note and slid into a chord. Her fingers flexed once in the air, as if pulling a string nobody else could see. The engine steadied. The stress frame climbed its chart into red. Catherine frowned. He hit a control. The frame screamed and increased pressure. The engine rocked once. The frame threatened to slip. The core flared with a gasping surge. "It needs a second voice," said Naira, eyes still closed. "I have only one song," said Elias. "Everyone has two," said Naira. Elias didn't know what that meant until he remembered the tune his father had used when coaxing a broken winch, a counter-melody that never tried to lead, only to stand beside. He whistled badly. Naira smiled with her mouth closed. The harmonic dampeners drank the chaos and sent it back transformed, like grief made into a story told around a fire. The engine's light settled into a slow, deep pulse. Catherine lowered his hand from the control. His face had collapsed into math, a man running numbers too quickly to notice he'd left out mercy. The group's laughter had died into that thin kind of silence that comes before peace's next choice. Two Imperial drones, silent as guilt, drifted closer to record the frame's angles. Elias realized with a spark of pride he couldn't afford that Naira had brought them here into something like beauty. And the machines had recognized her first. He looked at Naira. She opened her eyes. For a moment, he thought he saw a different room reflected in them. A chamber of black mirrors. Girls practicing steps they would never dance in public. A father who measured daughters with a ruler meant for monuments. "Enough," said Mara, voice shaking. "She did it." "We all saw." Catherine's mouth twisted. He reached for the emergency kill to rip the frame off the engine like a limb, to create a failure that could be blamed. His finger hesitated. "Touch that switch and I weld your hand to it," said Elias. Catherine blinked. He looked from Elias to Naira to the engine that refused to die as asked. The hall breathed again, a long shared exhale. It wasn't just knowledge, it was legacy, and suddenly silence fell across the crowd. The Empire loved a secret even more than it loved a show. When rumors reached the space court that the thrown-away daughter had sung a machine through cruelty, High Counselor Varen, Catherine's boss, came down to Aura to turn wonder into law. Varen was tall in the imperial way that made doors feel shorter in his presence. His robe was a book of gold letters written in a language only ambitious people pretended to read. He arrived without trumpets, which was its own kind of trumpet. "A resonance engine survives frame stress under irregular frame," said Vareen after the demonstration replayed, drones humming around him like obedient flies. "Explain?" "She listened," said Elias. "To what?" said Varen. "To the heart inside," said Elias. Varen's eyes registered amusement like a coin dropped into a well. "Poet mechanic, the Empire has lists for hearts. None are stored in engines." Naira stood to the side, the shape of refusal drawn small between her shoulders. "He is correct," said Naira softly, "but he is also correct. I listened to the heart mapped by the frame. Every engine has a ghost shape, the pattern it would choose if freed from the laziness of manuals." Varen turned his attention to her fully, and the hall felt smaller. "You speak as if the machines were family," said Vareen. "They are obedient only to those who treat them as more than." "Obedience," said Naira. Catherine hovered. Behind Varen like a stain. You will come to court, said Varen. The Emperor's act of generosity must not lead to country superstition. We will test you where the instruments can't lie. She won't go alone, said Elias. You are a mechanic of a field, said Varen. The court needs specialists in awe. I'll tune your engines until they confess all their sins, said Elias, but not without her. Varen's mouth curved. How quaint, said Varen. Bring your quaintness then. It's good for the court to remember that planets exist below us. They traveled in one of the slimmer Imperial shuttles, the kind built for speed and message. Aura shrank beneath them, a coin sinking into wheat. Naira pressed her forehead to the cold of the window. Elias watched stars tilt into the window like stones rising from a riverbed. Why did he give you away? Said Elias. Questions must be asked before they grow into walls. Naira didn't answer for a time long enough to make it almost honest. Because I'm not as tall as his expectations, said Naira. And because he watches the council watch him, and a ruler becomes what the room needs. Some rooms need cruelty to feel safe. Does he love you? Said Elias. He loves the story where he's never smaller than anything, said Naira. I don't fit that story, so he edited me out. Elias touched the armrest until his bones remembered being held. Then let's write a new story where engines sing back. When the shuttle docked at Nexus Aurelian, the Imperial capital, the first air that touched Elias tasted of lightning and metal fruit. Towers stabbed the sky, covered in gold that drank the sun until the city shone like a wound. Bridges veined the air between towers, carrying important people toward one another in a hurry that made meaning seem like a luxury. The hall of radiant proof smelled of polished stone and fear. There, scientists and interpretive engineers waited to turn anything odd into a rule. Varen stood at the center, hands folded as if praying to his own cleverness. The Emperor was absent. The absence thundered. Begin, said Varen. They handed Naira a singularity spindle, the kind of delicate device that nudged time around itself like a shawl. The test was clear. Line up its parts while a randomized field interfered. Then stabilize without reducing power. You're trying to force a small body through a huge frame, said Naira, hooking the spindle to a harness without looking at the instruction feed. It resists because you've written its future too tightly. The future prefers schedules, said Varen. Only for those afraid to look it in the eyes, said Naira. She began to work. The spindle bucked and whined. Data sprayed around the chamber like angry confetti. Elias listened for the low tone that meant fear, and the higher whisper that meant possibility. Naira found the cord between them. The spindle eased. Time in the room seemed to sigh and sit down. Several engineers took involuntary steps forward, like people watching a wave become a wall become a wave again. Varen's composure was a coin wearing thin. You've been trained, said Varen. Somewhere secret. Naira's mouth opened, then closed. The room leaned into the silence. She's the last apprentice of the Quiet Line, said Elias before he knew he would speak. Heads turned. The name hung like incense. The Quiet Line was rumor wrapped in ritual. A closed chapter of imperial science that treated machines like partners, supposedly ended, supposedly forbidden. Varen's eyes sharpened until a person could cut themselves. That lineage is erased, said Varen. Erased on paper, said Naira. Not in blood. And whose blood exactly? Said Varen. Naira swallowed. Elias saw the choice form and harden. Truth as rebellion or silence as survival. But the final blow came not from words. It came from a name the galaxy had long forgotten. From the high doors a shadow fell and Emperor Vaylor entered the hall. Silence is different when a ruler makes it. Words fall out of people's mouths and have nowhere to land. Vaylor walked until he stood within the circle of instruments. He looked at Naira, as if he hadn't expected to find her at the absolute center of a room. He looked at Elias as if humans had learned to grow spines while he wasn't watching. "The court speaks of an old line," said Vaylor. "A disobedient science." "It speaks of your daughter," said Varan, each syllable kneeling and rising in calculation. Vaylor looked at Naira. For a beat, the weight of his gaze bent the air. "The day I was crowned, I stood on a platform that made me taller than my father," said Vaylor. "I mistook the stone for my bones. Perhaps I've made that mistake again." Naira's hands trembled. "Father," said Naira, the word shaped like a long walk home and finding the door locked. "Did you build this spindle song?" said Vaylor. "I listened to it," said Naira. "And did you inherit a forbidden name?" said Vaylor. "You gave it to me the day you thought you threw me away," said Naira. "You stripped me of title and gave me work. The quiet line isn't a rebellion. It's a way of listening that refuses to make others smaller to feel tall." Varan shifted, sensing power tilt. Catherine called for congratulations, hugged the edge of the room like mold hugging a damp wall. Vaylor removed a glove. His blue skin beneath was scarred in the way only long rule scars a person. Notches where decisions had cut too close. He placed his bare hand on the spindle. The device thrummed. Naira's eyes shone. Elias stood still, heart doing a slow surprise thing. "Teach me the note," said Vaylor. "It's not one note," said Naira. "It's a conversation." They stood like that. Emperor, mechanic, daughter, machine. An old shape discovering a kinder version of itself. Engineers watched with the religious fear of people who suspect their life's altar is off by a degree. "The court won't easily love what humbles it," said Varan soft. "Dangerous." Vaylor didn't turn. "The court will adapt," said Vaylor. "It always has after it's snarled and counted." "And Catherine," said Mara, who had slipped into the hall like conscience finding an unlocked window. "He tried to force failure to keep his job safe." Catherine puffed his cheeks. "I followed procedure," said Catherine. "Your procedure was cruelty wearing a badge," said Elias. Vaylor's gaze flicked to Catherine. The overseer withered visibly, the way an opinion withers when required to stand alone. "Leave your badge," said Vaylor. "Find work where your breath can't bruise others." Catherine's hands shook as he unpinned his badge. It hit the floor with the sound of a small door closing. Vaylor looked again at Naira. The corners of his mouth did a thing like breaking and like being rebuilt. "I thought height would save us." "Perhaps listening will," said Vaylor. Naira's chin lifted. "I will return to Aura," said Naira, "with Elias. We have engines to teach and fields to hear. And if I forbid it?" said Vaylor, a father testing his last, least useful weapon. "Then you will have chosen your platform again," said Naira. Vaylor's hand fell. For a heartbeat, pride fought with love, the old imperial duel. Then he nodded. "Go and make a sound the Empire can't pretend not to hear," said Vaylor. They turned to leave, but as they crossed the doorway of the Hall of Radiant Proof, alarms opened like red flowers. The singularity spindle's output spiked. Varan's hand hovered near a hidden control. His mouth was calm. The room's time stuttered, then licked forward like a flame, warping the bridge outside into a bow. And as they walked away, the floor beneath them began to ripple. The ripple became a crack. The crack became possibility sharpened into danger. Varan had punched a number sequence that told the spindle to throw a time sleeve across the hall, enough to embarrass, perhaps to wound, certainly to reassert the math of power. He had written the Empire, a story where accidents rescued pride, but stories answer to singers. Naira spun, hands out. Elias grabbed the spindle's cord and planted his boots. The sleeve rolled toward them like glass becoming water. Valor stepped forward, armor shedding plates so his limbs could move cleanly. "The counter note," said Naira. "Do I remember it?" said Elias. "You remember grief?" "Bend it," said Naira. He whistled badly, tenderly. Valor's chest yielded a low tone that might once have called soldiers to formation. Now a father to belonging. Naira's voice braided between them, finding the gap Varin's numbers had insisted didn't exist. The sleeve shivered like arrogance reconsidering. Instruments spat data that refused to sit. Varin lunged to strengthen the sequence, but Mara slammed her palm on the auxiliary board, introducing a noise neither math nor cruelty had accounted for. The clatter of community when it closes ranks. The time sleeve thinned. Naira touched the spindle and whispered, not to the machine alone, "You're not their trick." "Choose," said Naira. It chose. The sleeve dissolved into a rain of bright, harmless seconds that soaked into skin like a promise kept. The hull exhaled a single breath that tasted of relief and of something new. Respect not for height but for harmony. Varin stood with his hand frozen, half-reaching. He had bet on failure and lost to a song. "Arrest him," said Valor quietly. Guards who had learned obedience by memory found themselves obeying something more human. Varin's robes rustled like a book slamming shut. Catherine, small without his badge, slipped away, learning at last the mercy of being forgotten after. There were hours that felt like the long evening after rain. Busy, gentle, important without shouting about it. Valor gathered an emergency council and drafted a decree relegalizing responsive mechanics, the old discipline his ancestors had labeled as heresy, to prevent their monuments from listening too closely. He named Naira First Listener. He named Elias Master of Field Harmonies, an absurd title that made them both laugh in private, then cry in a way that embarrassed neither. They returned to Aura with tools and a door opened in law. The barley bowed for them. Mara brought bread hot from a field oven. Children came curious and left embarrassed for the rhymes they had learned. Drones watched and learned new algorithms for wonder. Naira moved through the workshop with ease that looked like music. Elias learned how to let his old habits loose in the way bolts do in rain. He built benches for students who found their way from far settlements. He told them the first law. Listen until the machine begins to speak, then listen harder. They tuned pump hearts to drink less power. They taught scythes to bite kinder. They rewrote the etiquette between hand and hinge, empire and engine. The work spread faster than the empire could own it. Fields from Ariani to Solace. Rim wrote letters, real paper letters that smelled of dust and hope, asking for copies of the frame angles and of the three-voice chord that had calmed a time sleeve. Sometimes Valor visited without ceremony. He stood with his hands folded behind him and watched schoolchildren lay their palms to casings and laugh when resonance tickled their bones. He and Naira spoke in quiet corners, learning how to be father and daughter without the lie of platforms. Sometimes they argued. The arguments were better songs than silence had been. "Did I ruin years by measuring you against sky instead of soil?" said Valor once. "You gave me a field," said Naira. "I planted myself. You're invited to harvest." Elias kept working. He loved a woman once, long ago. He loved the plains, too. Now he loved this improbable family the way a man loves a thing he never learned to ask for because he didn't know it existed. He didn't put names to the love because some loves grow better without being forced into fancy shapes. He made breakfast, fixed engines, hummed in the wrong key, and it was often enough. On a night when the heat went soft and the barley shot silver under the moons, Naira and Elias stood by the fence where the fields begin to behave like sea. The machines in the shop hummed to themselves, settling into their dreams. "When you came, I thought you were a problem invited to dinner," said Elias. "When I came, I thought I was the joke told by a very large room," said Naira. "We were both wrong," said Elias. She nodded. "Father sent a message. The council wants to turn the chords into rules. They'll try to flatten them into schedules." "They always will," said Elias. "Our work will always be to keep the heart a little unruly." "Will you keep singing with me?" said Naira. "Badly and forever," said Elias. A wind moved through the barley in a long, patient arc. Somewhere an irrigation lung exhaled. The stars hung like bright punctuation in a sentence the world had been writing for a long time, and only now dared to read aloud. In the years that followed, Aura hosted the Concord of Listening. Craftspeople came who had grown tired of yelling instructions at things that wanted dialogue. The Empire bent, then bowed, then called it its idea, a small sin forgiven by the good it let through the gates. Valor aged into a man the world could exhale around. Naira grew, not in inches the court could count, but in reach. The taller courtiers found their eyes traveling downward more often to ask advice from the person whose height had once threatened them. Elias's hand stayed scarred. He kept his old wrench with the chipped tooth that fit a bolt nothing else did. He hung it by the door where burdens become tools. On certain nights, memory still reached out its hand, the bitter kind made of echo and hunger. He would pause then, set his palm to an engine casing and feel it answer back. Machines don't cure loneliness, but they keep it company. People do the rest. Years later, when a child asked how it all began, he didn't say, "A great emperor chose us." He didn't say, "The cruel man nearly undid us." He said, "A sky too big tried to convince a girl she was small." A mechanic was quiet enough to hear the lie closing in. "We learned a chord and played it until the room found a better story of itself," said Elias. Across the plains, 100 machines picked up his voice and made a low, contented sound. The barley kept breathing its ancient breath. The Empire remained ridiculous in armor, but more reasonable in law. And on a workbench, the first resonance engine Naira ever tuned in public still wore its frame with pride. Irregular, precise, forgiving. In a universe built on arrogance, sometimes a single act of dignity is enough to shift the stars themselves, and sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear them moving,